They laughed at it for 3 days. Then it erased 23 men in 19 seconds. No shots fired. No orders shouted. No time to understand what was happening. Because this wasn't a weapon. It was a design. A system that didn't care if grenades misfired, wires snapped, or men panicked. It only cared that once you stepped inside, there was no way out. They laughed because laughter is what soldiers use to kill doubt. In December 1944, Bastogne was not a place for experiments. It was surrounded, frozen, running on rationed ammunition and borrowed time. Men dug foxholes until their hands bled because that was work they understood. Rifles, sandbags, simple lines of fire. Anything else felt dangerous. So when one corporal spent 3 days assembling a dense web of grenades and wires instead of deepening his position, the reaction was predictable. Not fear, contempt. To the men around him, the problem wasn't the enemy. It was uncertainty. Grenades were supposed to be thrown, not engineered. Defenses were supposed to be obvious, not invisible. And in freezing temperatures, complexity was assumed to fail. Metal pins jammed. Springs lost tension. Fuses became unreliable. Every veteran in that perimeter had seen clever ideas collapse the moment weather, stress, or chaos intervened. So when they looked at the trap, they didn't see ingenuity. They saw waste. 57 grenades tied together meant 57 ways for something to go wrong. 23 wires meant 23 failure points. A system that depended on perfect timing, perfect conditions, and perfect execution had no place in a siege. That logic wasn't foolish. It was survival logic. Even the officers agreed. Resources were limited. Grenades were precious. If the line broke, every explosive would be needed in hand, not buried in snow. An order was prepared. If nothing happened soon, the trap would be dismantled. The grenades redistributed. The experiment ended. But what the laughter missed was subtle and deadly. The trap was not built on the assumption that everything would work. It was built on the assumption that something would fail. That distinction mattered. Where the others saw fragility, the corporal saw compensation. Where they counted grenades, he counted overlap. Where they imagined a single trigger snapping, he imagined 3 others taking over. He was not trying to control chaos. He was accepting it. This was not innovation driven by optimism. It was innovation driven by distrust. Distrust in equipment, in conditions, in human reaction time, and most of all, distrust in doctrine that treated weapons as isolated tools instead of parts of a whole. The men around him believed survival depended on doing familiar things correctly. He believed survival depended on designing a system that didn't care who made a mistake. That difference remained invisible while the perimeter was quiet, while the snow held, while the enemy stayed beyond the darkness. But in Bastogne, silence never lasts. And when the first boots eventually moved toward that sector, the laughter didn't matter anymore. Only the design did. The opposition to the trap was not ignorance. It was experience. Every soldier in that perimeter had learned the same lesson the hard way. In combat, simple things survive longer than clever ones. Rifles worked because they had few moving parts. Foxholes worked because dirt didn't freeze the way mechanisms did. A grenade worked because a man could see it, feel it, throw it. What Reeves had built violated that entire survival instinct. It required trust in wires hidden under snow, trust in pins that might freeze solid, trust that explosions would trigger other explosions in the right order, at the right moment, under the worst possible conditions. That kind of trust had gotten men killed before. The sergeant didn't see a system. He saw lost grenades. 57 explosives tied to the ground meant 57 weapons unavailable if the Germans broke through. In a siege, flexibility mattered more than theory. A grenade in the hand could adapt. A grenade in the snow could not. The lieutenant saw a different problem: probability. In freezing temperatures, mechanical reliability dropped sharply. Even well-manufactured fuses misfired. Trip mechanisms snapped. Metal shrank. Lubricants thickened. The more components a system had, the more chances it had to fail. That was basic field math. From their perspective, the trap wasn't bold. It was irresponsible. And then there was doctrine. Defensive planning was built around predictable responses. Enemy advances were met with observation, warning fire, and controlled engagement. Nothing in the manuals prepared officers for automated lethality without human decision. What Reeves was building removed judgment from the equation. Once triggered, it could not be stopped, redirected, or recalled. That made commanders uncomfortable, not because it was immoral, but because it was uncontrollable. In war, uncontrollable things create friendly casualties as often as enemy ones. So the order came down clearly: finish it if you must. But if it doesn't prove itself, dismantle it. The deadline wasn't punishment. It was risk management. Because no commander wanted to explain why his sector collapsed while grenades sat uselessly wired together. Reeves listened to every objection. He didn't argue emotionally. He didn't claim brilliance. He agreed with them partially. Yes, components fail. Yes, cold destroys mechanisms. Yes, complexity kills reliability. That was exactly why he had built it the way he did. They were judging the trap as a collection of fragile parts. He was judging it as a system designed to survive broken parts. The argument wasn't about grenades. It was about how failure should be treated. Most soldiers tried to avoid it. Reeves planned for it. That difference hadn't mattered yet. But the clock was moving. Reeves did not believe in reliability. He believed in compensation. That distinction separated him from everyone else in the perimeter. Most soldiers were trained to make weapons work under ideal assumptions. A clear throw, a clean detonation, a predictable effect. When something failed, it was treated as bad luck. Reeves approached failure as a certainty. Cold would freeze pins. Shock would snap wires. Fuses would misfire. Men would panic. None of that was hypothetical. It was guaranteed. So the question he asked was not how to prevent failure. It was how to make failure irrelevant. That mindset did not come from combat doctrine. It came from engineering logic. A system that depends on every component functioning correctly is not strong. It is fragile. Strength comes from redundancy, from overlap, from designing outcomes that do not rely on a single perfect action. Where others saw 57 grenades, Reeves saw coverage. Where they saw wires, he saw pathways. Where they saw triggers, he saw sequences. He arranged explosives so that no single blast mattered. What mattered was how blasts interacted. If one grenade failed, another compensated. If a wire snapped, tension shifted elsewhere. If timing drifted, spatial overlap absorbed the error. The system did not ask for precision. It demanded inevitability. That was the core difference. Traditional defenses reacted. Reeves' design anticipated. It assumed the enemy would move cautiously. It assumed they would attempt to identify danger. It assumed they would spread out when surprised. And it punished those assumptions by turning them into liabilities. Every escape route led deeper into coverage. Every attempt to disarm created secondary triggers. Every instinct trained into an experienced infantryman became predictable input. This was not brilliance in the cinematic sense. There was no sudden inspiration, no heroic moment of clarity. It was slow thinking applied under pressure. The same kind of thinking used to keep miners alive when machinery failed, to keep structures standing when components broke, to ensure that when something went wrong, everything didn't collapse with it. Reeves trusted geometry more than courage, probability more than instinct, systems more than men. That trust made him dangerous not because he ignored chaos, but because he accounted for it. While others dug deeper, he calculated coverage. While others waited for contact, he built inevitability. And because his thinking operated at a level the enemy could not see, the trap did not need surprise. It only needed one step in the wrong place. From the outside, the trap looked chaotic. Wires disappearing into snow. Grenades positioned at uneven heights. No clean line. No obvious logic. That was deliberate. A neat system invites understanding. Understanding invites countermeasures. Reeves did not want the enemy to see the trap. He wanted them to misunderstand it. The design did not rely on a single trigger. It relied on thresholds: movement, pressure, heat, vibration. Each was treated as a possible signal, not a requirement. Any one of them could start the sequence. None of them had to be perfect. The outer layer existed to do one thing: initiate confusion. It did not need to kill. It needed to disrupt formation and timing. Once that happened, the rest of the system took over. Grenades were placed so their effective zones overlapped, not evenly, but deliberately offset. This created areas where multiple blast patterns intersected. Not gaps to avoid, funnels to enter. If a soldier tried to move away from the first explosions, his movement carried him into heavier coverage. If he dropped prone, fragments still reached him from elevated positions. If he attempted to retreat, secondary detonations closed behind him. There was no correct response, only less incorrect ones. Reeves assumed that some grenades would fail, so he positioned others to cover that failure. He assumed wires would snap, so each wire served multiple functions. Nothing was singular. Everything was layered. The system did not require synchronization by timing devices. It used space instead. Explosions triggered other explosions not by electronics, but by physics. Pressure displaced weight. Heat weakened metal. Shock released tension. These effects did not care about cold. They did not rely on lubrication. They functioned whether conditions were perfect or terrible. This was the heart of the design. It removed precision as a dependency. Reeves was not trying to choreograph a sequence. He was building a cascade. Once the first condition was met, the rest followed automatically. Not because each step was flawless, but because the design made alternative outcomes impossible. Most traps fail because they ask too much of a single component. This one asked very little of many. Each grenade only had to do part of the work. Each trigger only had to function once. The system absorbed the rest. To soldiers trained to think in actions, this looked reckless. To an engineer trained to think in systems, it was conservative. It did not maximize destruction. It minimized uncertainty. By the time the trap was finished, Reeves was not watching it. He was watching the terrain, because the final piece of the system was not metal or wire. It was prediction. And prediction would decide whether the machine ever mattered. In Bastogne, ideas were allowed only as long as they didn't interfere with survival. Reeves's trap had reached that limit. Command did not argue theory anymore. They argued time. Every hour spent maintaining the system was an hour not spent reinforcing positions that everyone understood. Every grenade tied to wire was one less grenade available if the line collapsed. So the deadline was set. If the trap did not justify itself by dawn, it would be dismantled, not debated, not revised, taken apart. The order was not personal. It was operational, because a commander's responsibility is not to reward originality. It is to reduce risk. And from the outside, Reeves' system still looked like risk. Reeves did not protest. He did not appeal to intelligence, education, or foresight. He accepted the order, but he asked for time, not more resources, not more grenades, just hours. He explained it simply. This sector was the weakest point in the perimeter. It had the least cover, the fewest men, the clearest approach. Any competent enemy commander would see it immediately. And a competent enemy does not attack evenly. He attacks where success is most likely. Reeves was not guessing. He was projecting. German doctrine emphasized probing for weakness before committing force. Night infiltration. Small units testing the line. If they passed through undetected, larger elements would follow. That meant one thing. If the Germans attacked at all, they would come here first. The trap was not built for a hypothetical enemy. It was built for a specific behavior, and Reeves was willing to let the system stand or fall on that prediction. The sergeant studied him longer than before, not because he was convinced, but because Reeves was calm in a way that didn't match recklessness. This was not a man hoping for validation. It was a man waiting for confirmation. The agreement was simple: 12 hours. If nothing happened by then, the grenades would be recovered and used the normal way. No arguments. No exceptions. Reeves returned to his position and made final adjustments. He did not add complexity. He removed unnecessary dependency. He checked tension, spacing, coverage. He tested nothing twice that only needed to work once. Because now the system was no longer theoretical. It was exposed to the only judge that mattered: the enemy. And the night was moving fast. Night erased whatever confidence daylight had left. By midnight, Baston was silent, in the way only a besieged position becomes. Not calm, but suspended. Reeves did not sleep. He checked nothing that could not be checked without disturbing the system. Once a mechanism was set, touching it again only introduced error. So he waited. Coal pressed into metal. Snow hardened. Every sound carried farther than it should. Shortly before dawn, artillery began to speak. The first shells landed wide, probing. Then closer, high explosives and air bursts walking their way along the perimeter. The bombardment was not aimed at killing men. It was aimed at killing certainty. Foxholes shook. Earth collapsed inward. Shrapnel cut through frozen branches overhead. Each impact forced the same question through Reeves' mind. Had the shock set something off early? Had a grenade detonated out of sequence? Had the system collapsed before it was ever tested? He could not check. Checking would mean movement. Movement would mean disturbance. Disturbance would mean guessing. So he stayed still and listened. Around him, soldiers cursed the cold and the noise. Someone laughed nervously when a shell landed close. Another shouted over the blasts that Reeves's trap was probably gone now. Maybe it was. That was the risk Reeves had accepted. The bombardment lasted minutes that felt like hours. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence afterward was heavier than the shells, because Reeves knew what followed. Artillery prepared the ground. Infantry exploited it. German doctrine relied on that rhythm. Suppress, advance, infiltrate before defenders could reorganize. Reeves pressed deeper into his foxhole and watched the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then sound. Not shouting, not engines. Footsteps, careful, measured, too deliberate to be anything but trained men. Snow crunched under weight it could not hide. Reeves counted without moving his head. 1, 2, more behind them. A patrol, not charging, testing, exactly what he had predicted. They moved slowly, scanning for mines, wires, obvious obstacles. They did not rush. They did not bunch. Professionals. They advanced along the shallow approach route Reeves had marked days earlier, the same path officers had dismissed as unimportant. The trap remained invisible. The outer wires were too low to catch moonlight. Snow and shadow hid everything else. Reeves did not breathe deeply. This moment was beyond him now. If the system worked, it would do so without his help. If it failed, no human reaction could save it. The patrol reached the edge of the kill zone. They paused. A man knelt. Another gestured. The pause was brief but fatal. A boot lifted. And then came contact. The first detonation was not the event. It was the signal. A single step released tension where tension was meant to be released. Not because a wire worked perfectly, but because something moved where movement was forbidden. 3 grenades detonated almost together. Not enough to erase a patrol, enough to steal time. The German soldiers reacted exactly as training demanded. They scattered. They dropped. They tried to identify the source. That reaction sealed the outcome. The first blast displaced weight that had been carefully balanced. Gravity did the rest. Additional grenades fell not because anyone triggered them, but because the blast wave made stillness impossible. Heat followed pressure. Metal weakened where it was meant to weaken. More tension released. The system was no longer waiting. It was cascading. There was no single direction of danger now. Fragments came from overlapping angles. Cover did not behave like cover. Men who moved toward safety entered heavier zones. Men who froze were caught by elevated detonations. Men who tried to retreat triggered secondary effects meant to close behind them. Every instinct trained into them, spread out, take cover, pull back, was answered in advance. Not by intelligence, by geometry. Explosions overlapped not in time, but in space. Each detonation mattered less than the pattern they formed together. Some grenades did not detonate. It did not matter. Their absence changed nothing. Other explosions filled the gaps immediately. Redundancy absorbed failure without pause. This was the difference Reeves had built for. The system did not depend on every component. It depended on enough components. As the sequence continued, pressure triggered mechanisms that were never meant to be seen or understood in the dark. They required no decision, no confirmation, no awareness, only physics. Within seconds, the patrol stopped behaving like individuals, not because of panic, but because the environment no longer allowed meaningful choice. There was nowhere to move that reduced risk. Every movement increased it. That was the trap's true function. It did not kill quickly because it was powerful. It killed quickly because it denied adaptation. By the time the final detonations occurred, the result was already decided, not by the last blast, but by the first step. The entire sequence lasted 19 seconds, long enough for mechanisms to complete their work, too short for human response to matter. When silence returned, it was absolute. No follow-up fire, no commands shouted, no movement calling for attention, just disturbed ground and scattered equipment where a patrol had been. Reeves did not move immediately. He did not need to. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. Not exceed expectations, but fulfill assumptions. Nearby, soldiers slowly emerged from their positions. They did not cheer. They stared. Because what they had witnessed did not feel like combat. It felt like a rule had been violated. An enemy element had been erased without engagement, without warning, without chance. The trap had not won a fight. It had prevented one from happening. And in that moment, 19 seconds long, laughter finally disappeared. The first man to reach the edge of the kill zone did not step inside it. He stopped. Veterans know the difference between destruction caused by combat and destruction caused by something else. This was not the aftermath of a firefight. There were no firing positions, no spent casings, no direction of engagement. The ground itself had done the work. The sergeant approached slowly, scanning for movement that never came. He counted without meaning to, then counted again, because the number did not feel real. No wounded called out. No one crawled away. The patrol was simply gone. For a long moment, no one spoke, because words would have turned what they were seeing into something familiar. And this was not familiar. Someone finally asked the question that mattered most. How many grenades? The answer came quietly. Enough. That response ended the argument that had lasted 3 days. The lieutenant arrived soon after, not as a commander, but as an observer. He did not issue orders. He inspected. He followed the pattern backward, from the center outward, from effect to cause. Wires half buried in snow. Fragments embedded at angles that made no sense until they did. Mechanisms that should not have worked in that cold, yet clearly had. This was not luck. Luck leaves gaps. This did not. What unsettled them most was not the destruction. It was the absence of improvisation. No soldier could have done this alone. No reflex could have reacted this fast. The system had removed people from the decision loop entirely. That realization changed the tone. What had been mockery became caution. What had been resistance became curiosity. Officers did not ask if it could work again. They asked where it should be placed next. Word moved faster than orders. Men who had laughed days earlier now stood silently, replaying their own certainty and finding it empty. They had trusted familiarity. It had nearly cost them an entire sector. Reeves was not congratulated. He was questioned. Not aggressively, precisely. What failed? What nearly failed? What would fail next time? Those were the right questions, and Reeves answered them without defensiveness. Because the system was not perfect. It had not needed to be. 3 grenades had not detonated. It had changed nothing. That fact mattered more than the ones that had exploded. It proved the point Reeves had never tried to sell with words. The trap worked not because everything went right, but because enough things went right at the same time. In Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, that was a dangerous lesson, and it was about to spread. The most important consequence of the trap did not happen on the American side. It happened somewhere in the dark, behind German lines, where reports were being written by men who had not been there but had to explain what went wrong. From their perspective, a patrol had vanished, not engaged, not repelled, erased. No return fire, no warning shots, no clear indication of what had triggered the destruction. That absence mattered. German doctrine depended on interpretation. Patrols probed defenses not only to test strength, but to collect information. Where were the firing positions? What weapons responded first? How quickly did Americans react? This patrol brought back none of that. What commanders received instead were fragments of equipment recovered days later, blast patterns that made no tactical sense, and survivor reports from other sectors describing explosions that appeared to move, spread, and close off space. The conclusion was inevitable. This was not an improvised defense. It was a system. German officers labeled it as such in their own language. An automated explosive field, a new kind of mine system, something that combined mines, artillery effects, and delayed triggers. That interpretation was wrong, but it was devastating, because armies feared technology more than individuals. A clever soldier can be countered. A new system requires caution, analysis, delay. Delay was exactly what Bastogne needed. Orders changed. Infiltration routes were reconsidered. Night probes slowed. Engineers were requested to study countermeasures that did not yet exist. Each hesitation cost time, and time was the one resource the Germans could not spare. What made the misinterpretation so powerful was that it was reasonable. No rational officer would assume that one corporal, with standard-issue grenades, had designed something that removed reaction time entirely. So they assumed capability instead of creativity. That assumption infected planning. Commanders stopped asking, "Where is the weak point?" They started asking, "What else don't we see?" In siege warfare, that shift is fatal. The Americans did not exploit the fear directly. They did not need to. The Germans did the work themselves by second-guessing every approach. A system had not only killed a patrol, it had altered enemy behavior. On the American side, this effect was invisible at first. There were no immediate follow-up attacks through the same sector. No renewed probes. No pressure. The line held, not because it was stronger, but because the enemy no longer trusted his understanding of it. That was the trap's true reach. It did not just remove soldiers. It removed confidence. And once confidence collapses, doctrine follows. Bastogne was not saved in 19 seconds. But 19 seconds were enough to change how the enemy thought. And in war, thought dictates movement. Movement dictates outcomes. The Germans never realized what they were actually facing, and that ignorance became the Americans' greatest advantage. Once the first result existed, everything changed. Not because anyone suddenly admired Reeves, but because the system had proven it could be repeated. Command did not ask for stories. They asked for coverage. Where else could it work? Which approaches mattered most? How long would it take to build another? Those questions marked the transition from anomaly to method. Reeves was given what he had not asked for before: time, assistance, and permission. The same soldiers who had laughed now carried grenades and wire back to his position, not with enthusiasm, with attention. The work was slower than before, not because it was more complex, but because it was being watched. Reeves did not teach procedures. He taught principles: redundancy before efficiency, overlap before range, failure as a design input, not an exception. Each man learned to stop thinking in throws and start thinking in space. Where would movement naturally go? Where would fear push a man? Where would instinct lead him when light disappeared? The second system went in on a different approach route. The terrain was not identical, so the design was not copied. That mattered. This was not a blueprint. It was a framework. Angles changed. Spacing changed. Triggers adapted to ground and vegetation. But the logic remained. When the Germans came again, the result was similar, not because the trap was the same, but because the thinking was. Another patrol disappeared. The time varied slightly. The count changed. The conclusion did not. By the third system, Reeves was no longer building alone. The men assisting him were not imitating motions. They were making decisions. That was the true replication. Once a system can be understood, it can spread. And when it spreads, it stops being remarkable. The Americans did not suddenly become innovators. They became methodical. The traps did not win battles by themselves. They shaped the battlefield, so battles did not need to happen where the enemy expected them. That shift was subtle. There were no dramatic announcements. No orders declaring a new doctrine, just fewer attacks, longer pauses, hesitation where confidence had been. The perimeter held, not because it was reinforced with more men, but because the enemy no longer trusted his map of it. Reeves had not created a superweapon. He had changed how a few soldiers thought about defense. That change multiplied faster than any explosion, and in a siege measured in hours and morale, that mattered more than raw firepower. After Bastogne, the trap stopped being a story. It became a problem to be explained. Armies do not like anomalies. They challenge predictability. They threaten doctrine built on repetition. So the incident was not celebrated. It was dissected. Reports were written that stripped away personality and emotion. What remained were patterns, casualty ratios, time to effect, area coverage, failure rates. The numbers were uncomfortable. Coordinated detonation produced results that individual employment could not match. Overlapping effects denied reaction in ways training never addressed. Redundancy compensated for defects without reducing lethality. Most importantly, the system functioned even when components failed. That last point mattered more than all the rest. Traditional infantry doctrine assumed reliability came from simplicity. This case suggested the opposite. Reliability came from design that anticipated collapse. The idea spread quietly, not as a mandate, but as a principle. Training materials began to change language. Grenades were no longer described only as thrown weapons. They were described as area denial tools, as components that could be coordinated rather than expended individually. Engineers took notice. Defensive planning manuals began emphasizing overlapping fields and denial zones. Sequential effects replaced isolated actions. Years later, when new weapons were designed to deliver directional fragmentation across defined arcs, the logic felt familiar, even if the origin was not discussed openly. Systems thinking had entered the bloodstream, not because one corporal was exceptional, but because the battlefield had revealed a flaw in how problems were framed. The trap forced a re-evaluation of assumptions soldiers did not realize they were carrying. That human reaction time is enough. That individual courage compensates for exposure. That chaos favors the adaptable. Bastogne suggested something harsher. Chaos favors the prepared system. The lesson was not about explosives. It was about structure. The same principles appeared elsewhere, in layered defenses, in networked fire support, in the idea that effectiveness is created before contact, not during it. By the time these ideas were formalized, the trap itself no longer mattered. It was a proof, not a prototype. Reeves returned to anonymity, not because he was forgotten, but because the military absorbed what it needed and moved on. Institutions do that. They do not remember individuals. They remember methods. And once a method becomes doctrine, it stops being remarkable. It becomes invisible. They laughed at it because they thought they understood it. To them, it was just grenades and wires. Too many parts. Too many ways to fail. What they never questioned was their own assumption. That effectiveness comes from doing simple things perfectly. Bastogne proved the opposite. The trap worked not because it was flawless, but because it accepted that nothing in war ever is. Pins froze, fuses misfired, components failed, and the system absorbed all of it. That is why the 19 seconds mattered. Not because of how many men died, but because something else died with them. Certainty. The certainty that doctrine always protects you. That training prepares you for every threat. That familiar ideas are safer than unfamiliar ones. The German patrol did not lose because it lacked courage or discipline. It lost because it faced a system designed beyond human reaction. The Americans who mocked the trap were not foolish. They were human. They trusted what had worked before. They distrusted what they could not immediately recognize. That instinct exists everywhere, in armies, in institutions, in organizations that confuse tradition with reliability. Reeves did not win because he was a genius. He won because he framed the problem differently. He did not ask how to fight better. He asked how to remove fighting altogether. He did not design for success. He designed for failure and let success emerge anyway. That way of thinking is rare because it is uncomfortable. It forces you to admit that things will break, that people will panic, that plans will collapse, and that pretending otherwise is the most dangerous belief of all. They stopped laughing when the results became undeniable. They stopped arguing when the system worked without them. And long after the trap was dismantled, the idea remained. Because once you understand that systems outperform individuals, you can never unsee it. They called it a stupid trap. Then it erased an attack before it began. And in doing so, it exposed a truth that armies and people often learn too late. The ideas that sound the strangest are often the ones built for reality